coming to our Teachers Talking Teaching series, spring semester. We really appreciate you coming. And we're really excited that Dr. Kim Rostan is going to talk to us today about interdisciplinarity. She did her degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in English and African American literature?
African language.
African language and literature. And she also teaches awesome classes that I don't have the list of in front of me, but she'll probably mention them in her talk, and that would be great.
Probably.
So, thank you.
Oh, you guys. Well, I was thinking if I talk too little, it's wasting their time, and if I talk too much, it's wasting their time. So I'm very aware of my inadequacy on this topic. Looking at those of you here, I can imagine any of you talking on this topic, and I would be taking notes. Well, the title of the talk suggests, well, actually what it says is that I'm going to talk about interdisciplinarity. Anybody else see that? Yeah, I got a good giggle out of that all weekend. I'm into, yeah. Anyway, so, but I was thinking about this as someone who sort of stands on the edge of her field and sees what she can reach from there. And I like food a lot, so of course I use the omnivore term. And actually, this was in a discussion with Kate and Luke, who is the one who nailed down the title, because I wanted to say something about being a cannibal, and they thought that was gross. But a cannibal or other things I thought of, a poacher or an extraterrestrial. But sometimes the fact that we proliferate names for something suggests an inherent discomfort with the topic. And sometimes it's just that the thing that we're going to name reveals a wellspring of creativity. And for me, it's probably some of both when it comes to interdisciplinarity. And I probably should have said something about the anxieties of interdisciplinarity teaching. I know lots about those, and those are implied in sort of the name of the talk, the whole idea of somebody who's an omnivore, who's around eating up things Pac-Man style, or a cannibal or a poacher. And I think that has something to do with our sense of purity and danger when it comes to lines around fields or disciplines. It's maybe there's that taboo about mixing, but it's also exciting. And I'm a product of all of that. I think I'll talk a little bit. I'm going to move out from general to particulars, and then my idea is hopefully this will move to a conversation, because I think a lot of us are really itching to talk about interdisciplinarity, and sometimes I just want to ask other people if they can come to my class and talk about the stuff I'm doing this week. Somebody know anything about Buddhism? You know, I was going to hit you up to talk about it. At a liberal arts school, I think we kind of default to our primary interdisciplinarity is multidisciplinary. That we teach within disciplines, we teach students, and then they go off to do things, you know, later that are more interdisciplinary. They do capstone projects, or they're making these connections. Their brains are firing, we hope, after class, about the thing that one of my students, Tremaine Brown, called a Wofford moment. When, you know, you talk about cosmopolitanism in a class with English majors, and they say, we just talked about this in philosophy, and someone else says, we just talked about it in Dave Alvis's class, then something's happening there that's pretty exciting. I think, yeah, that we call that multidisciplinary when you're looking at things from multiple lenses, and maybe transdisciplinary when we're all sitting at the table trying to figure out what it is, how are we going to relate to each other? You know, what is it that we all have in common again? You know, there's that nice orderly sequence there that, you know, get the students trained in a certain discipline, and then we'll figure out how to apply it, you know, holistically later. And I'm certainly a product of that education. And then from my title, I think the person I'm describing on the edge of her field, looking for other stuff that looks within reach, is more the cross-disciplinary. Lots of people organize these into terms, and anytime something starts to get a terminology or rules about it, I tend to lose interest, but I think that sometimes this can be clarifying, just to acknowledge that there are different modes of interdisciplinarity and different degrees of interdisciplinarity, and for the most part, I feel like I probably am more in the cross-disciplinary, where I teach classes on nonfiction testimony and truth commission sometimes, not entire courses, but classes, and that's my field it's one of my areas of research. So if you have an English major reading about Truth Commission's archives, that to me is cross-disciplinary. If you have a sociologist talking about music, That's cross-disciplinary. But I define interdisciplinary more as a study that integrates multiple perspectives into something a little more cohesive. And here's the part, I think, where there's usually some creative disagreement. I think it's useful to think about a subject when I'm planning for a course or planning a class prep for the day or having a class discussion. I think it's useful to think of how a topic is interdisciplinary from the ground up rather than retrospectively. I think that's really demanded by my field. And when I say my field, I mean that I teach in fields that seem to exceed the boundaries of discipline sometimes. Where if you're going to teach Holocaust literature or world literature, for example, some of those fields feel like it makes it impossible to contain in a single discipline. And I think I was looking around to see if I have historians in the room, but I think that happened in particular with Holocaust studies, when it required a lot of people to get in a room together from Hebrew studies, Holocaust studies, English, historians, psychiatry, German studies departments, right, where it took that kind of cooperation, and then you have sort of the Hayden Whites and the Dominic LeCapras of the history field talking about historiography. If Hayden White started to look at how is history written, well, it has epic and tragedy and comedy and romance, and Dominic LeCapra is writing about traumatic gaps in history. So there are certain cases where I feel like there are things that feel like they exceed the possibility of just looking at it from a single lens in a classroom. And I think gender studies would be one of those for sure. First gender studies department in 1970, I think. Climate studies and environmental studies. I think about those, and I think about environmental studies in particular, and I think this might be where it's beneficial to think about what if we look at a topic like climate change as interdisciplinary first, rather than as training people in disciplines. And I can talk about the sciences because I know nothing about them, so I'm just going to hypothesize that maybe they would benefit from this. But if you talk about climate change, maybe we want to start about thinking of it as a interdisciplinary from the ground up, and maybe have things like environmental studies departments, and so we do. I think modern language studies, area studies emerged from this. There are lots of origin stories for where area studies came from and where interdisciplinary discussions happened. I think John Dewey is part of one of the explanations. I think gender studies departments in post-colonial, sort of a wave of decolonization in the 60s and 70s had a lot to do with it. And apparently also there's an aspect of this I found just poking around online that I wasn't aware of, that the Ford Foundation gave grants to the social sciences, big ones in the 50s and 60s, so that our American scholars would have more depth about other countries. Is this related to the Cold War? See, I've got someone else I can ask these questions. But I think about political science being a very interdisciplinary field, and sociology as well. So I guess what I'm going to talk about just for a minute is my sort of modest attempt at interdisciplinarity. I mean, I told you that it's one of those anxiety-causing things. Am I doing this? Am I doing this right? Is it happening? I don't know, but I'm going to reflect a little bit. So I teach fiction and non-fictional testimony, so representations of, and that's one of my areas. I teach a lot of things. I teach African literature. I teach a world lit survey. I'm clearly comfortable with breadth and not always knowing what I'm doing with the degree of expertise that I think maybe I should be burdened by, but I'm not. So I might teach a 20th century representation of the Holocaust that requires me to provide and my students to understand traumatic memory, narrative structures, history, psychiatry, philosophy, sometimes even theological context. Primo Levi is a good example of someone, right? And this is where I start to think about English as a pretty useful example of a department that's interdisciplinary, because the books that we teach, the writers that we teach are interesting, and sometimes they're chemists like Primo Levi, right? You follow their lead and they'll take you everywhere. I find, and I am at some point going to talk about what I actually do in the classroom, but I find what's useful about teaching pockets, I'll call them pockets of history, pockets of, I have my students sometimes are reading about trauma and therapy and memory. Sometimes they're watching and critically analyzing history channels, sometimes they're reading history. But I find that it's not just that it accounts for the expansiveness or the excessiveness of a topic, but that I think there's something valuable about the interconnectedness and empathy for other fields of study in the classroom. And I don't want to mystify the process of what I do in terms of I have to read history in order to understand what I'm going to teach in the classroom. And if I'm doing that, I want my students to be doing some of it too. That's part of the purpose of it for me, to ask students to do things that maybe I wasn't necessarily trained in. I had history classes in college, but not in graduate school. But I'm having to read for historical context because I'll tell you, it's one of the, if you're teaching in world literature, or if you're teaching, I use the example of Holocaust literature, students want to know context. Even though they can go at any moment that they need to, they can go Google something, they won't. And they want all sorts of contexts, and that's the one sort of weakness in my teaching I've been working to address for a few years when I'm doing something like a world literature survey. There are challenges, the challenges I've run into have been, well, there are several, but one of them is, what if I don't understand something? What if I get to the end of Kawabata Yasunari's Snow Country, and I'm not sure what was happening in Japanese feminism at the moment, but there are two women, one of them likely dying and the other one crying, and then another man is standing next to them having a meditative moment and connecting with the universe. Is this in Buddhism? Right, is it, there are questions that I run into, and I have to do ages of research, and most recently I contact Levy McLaughlin. He was like, oh, that's an interesting question. I'm gonna send you to my friend the expert at Oregon State, and the friend the expert hasn't emailed me back in a year, right? So, there are times that I won't mention names because nobody in this room, I send a novel to someone, and I was like, maybe you could read this and we could talk about it over the summer, but sometimes it's really hard to get information about a book. I'm also quite comfortable with uncertainty and not knowing all the answers, because I think that's in, I teach a lot of postmodern literature, that's kind of acceptable, not to resolve things. But there are times where I feel like there are probably some answers I could research and find answers to, and I do, to my best ability, and sometimes I hit a wall. So one of the things I'd be interested in is any sort of forum or lunches where we can, have a space to ask the person that question. Sometimes it weights down a conversation at lunch, where we can talk about anything at lunch in the FDR, but sometimes you don't want to cut across the entire table and say, I've been meaning to catch you and ask you this question about this place or this thing in your research. And I want to talk about this too at the department level. Many of us are trained, most of us trained in graduate school in a major discipline. There's something so appealing about how coherent that sounds, but it always, for me, just sort of barely contained the chaos. Because, if you're looking at Wofford's English department, here are some of the things that are very at home in our department, and some of them sound as though they belong elsewhere. Philosophy, you guys let me know if I'm leaving anything out. Psychoanalysis, history, human rights movements, nonfiction, fiction, film. What else? I'm leaving out some things, but rhetoric. Thank you. Yes, that too. But our texts are far-reaching, and sometimes we have to reach far too. So I think it's because we love metaphor, right? That going beyond the literal. That we're at heart geared to understand the way that one instance of language can transport us somewhere else. And English departments now include lots of Englishes. I teach a world literature survey, and one of the things that I tell my students on the first day of class is that world literature is haunted. And what I mean by that is that you're going to be reading a text that was translated, and there may be something that you're missing. I may give you all kinds of context to help you understand this book, but there may be uncertainties that you're left with, and maybe they're existential, but maybe it's because we're reading across cultures. Or it may be that someone in that place is reading that book and thinking something different from you, and that both of these are valid readings. Or I always tell them my syllabus is haunted, because at some point, if I were looking at how would a person from Beirut or a person from Cuba write a world literature survey? And would the person from Beirut include the writing from Beirut that I had included? Right? Not everybody in South Asia thinks that Salman Rushdie or R.K. Narayan represent South Asia. And so there are all sorts of those questions I run into in teaching. World literature is one of those excessive, it's ridiculous. The idea of that being manageable, you have to find nodes in terms of like intersections of times and places you feel like you can manage, and crossovers, comparative themes. But I do feel that it is haunted, and we have to read in that way that is aware that you might still be searching for some answers after class. So going back to something I said before, I'll just wrap up by saying, on the one hand, I think I do teach interdisciplinary topics. Human rights is not something that you want to be owned by one particular discipline. I don't think it exceeds that. Sometimes, though, in a semester, I teach in a way that I consider, it being interdisciplinary, as I mentioned before, which is I might have students read a UN resolution, and that's referenced in a literary work, but I might have them go a little more into the workings of the UN in the situation where I was talking about with classes about Rwanda. That was fruitful, and it had a lot to do with the way that narrative was spun. So it wasn't unrelated to my discipline. It wasn't necessarily my discipline either. So some of the things that I've done that feel like I'm reaching when I'm teaching that aren't just content driven, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit, because I feel like when you're asking students to look at something from another lens, and it's not just, I'm going to give you this as background while I then focus on my field. I sometimes ask them to do assignments, and to do them from a perspective I wasn't necessarily trained in. And because I'm an anxious and conscientious person, I don't usually give these huge percentage weights. Because I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I have them do. So here's some of the things that I've done, some of the projects I've asked students to do. I've had them do field studies, actual ethnographic reflections in a race, gender, and empire course on over Thanksgiving. I had them observe and interview family members, and that we were working on something about American identity. I've had them watch a film to demonstrate how a distance camera shot does something like a travel writer opening an account with a view of Africa from an airplane. That film, I think, comes up a lot in our classes and in English departments too. I've had students design a memorial for a collective atrocity in the United States, and to read the debates that occurred over the designing of the World Trade Center memorial. I've had students design an exhibit. They curated the one that's in the library right now, the 3D exhibit. They didn't get grade credit for that. I don't know how I convinced them to do this, but we looked at the way that curation eventually, they were reading curation theory and what it means to curate, but eventually they discovered, and I urged them to discover, that it's a lot like making an argument. I've had them read chapters by Ruth Lays and Dory Lobb, both of them are psychiatrists, about trauma. I've had them analyze History Channel's representations of World War II histories to see how or if, usually the answer is no, they refer to concentration camps, or to think about the ways that primary sources narrate a historical event, and think about overlaps between narration. A lot of the events, a lot of the books that I teach are historical events. So if I have someone like Edwidge Danticat writing The Farming of Bones, she's writing about an actual genocide in the Dominican Republic, But she's also directly responding to a gap in history where she feels like I couldn't go and read what had happened to my family, what had happened to my ancestors. And so there is automatically a comment on another discipline. So I think I'll stop there and just sum up by saying I feel like one thing that I can do is always gesture to, if I can't provide the approach that another discipline would take, I will at least gesture to its absence, I think, in terms of, and I'm constantly having to do this with my world literature survey, and I didn't like it at first because I felt like it's a survey, they should be getting knowledge. And I finally broke down and submitted, but I think what I'm having now is students from, who are coming and, letting me know, oh, well, this is actually the linguistic origin of this, or that they contribute. And they're quite comfortable doing it, and it means I have to do a little more work because I actually go back. I might not know what they said in class. I might not have known it previously, but I'll go and check it because then I feel like if it's been said, I need to make sure I can verify it. But they contribute a lot, and that's one of sort of the most fun and prevalent means of interdisciplinary teaching I do is to bring in student perspectives or to tell them to go research it and find out more than their random comment and come back. But I'd love to stop there and just hear from other people about their experiences or what you define as interdisciplinary teaching. Or I know, I didn't want to talk about it from a perspective of what I think is and isn't interdisciplinary. I know I talked about the terms because I feel like those can be clarifying, but I think I get nervous when I start thinking in terms of, is this right or is this a wrong way to approach it? I think there are lots of avenues, and I'd love to hear, what other people have to say about it in a liberal arts context or just in the context of classes they teach in. I mean, does that, I can pick on my friends. You're all my friends, but I can pick on my colleagues in the English department. Is that interdisciplinary when we're using histories to sort of, it seems to me like we work really hard in our department to protect our texts from disciplined readings, right? Where you've got, you wouldn't want it to be owned as an instrumental, you wouldn't have work of literature to be owned and instrumentalized as an example of X politics, right? Or Y history. So we tend to make everything kind of loose, contingent backgrounds, or at least I feel like I do. Let me give you 5 background things you might want to think about as you're reading the novel. Yeah.
Well, but see, I'm loving this conversation because it helps me think a lot about skills and attributes I'd like for students to develop in their learning. So I'm kind of coming at it that way, but it seems to me that when we think about teaching, we're looking at all kinds of boundaries, and we're looking at temporal boundaries because we're looking at 13 weeks. We're looking at time frames of literature or geographic boundaries. We are looking at genre as boundaries, or we're looking at reader as a boundary. What do you know, what do you not know? And I'm awfully interested in all of those boundaries. And it seems to me, as I'm coming away from this, it seems to me that what you're encouraging, and I'm going to use a plain word, but I like it, is a curiosity about what is that boundary. But then if it's a construct, how do I cross it? Or am I even crossing it? Am I just looking at the creation of it? But for me, to open up students to that possibility is one of the best things we do in a liberal arts education, because eventually they can figure out how to answer some of the questions. I worry so much about their unwillingness to ask questions and their desire for something to be boxed. And I sort of understand their generation because there is so much. When I was here at Wofford, there wasn't that much to know, apparently. I don't know. There wasn't much, but now there is so much that you can, and it's right there. And I think we would hope, all of you said, they could Google it, and they don't. And I think if we, just thinking about all the different ways that you can box it, the curiosity that it inspires for me is one of the nicest parts of kind of sitting here and listening to you talk today. So I'm now done. It's somebody else's turn, but for me, that's a very fine thing that you're doing, and I don't know what language I would put on it, but I like it very, very much.
I'll put a word on it.
Good.
You're achieving transfer.
There,
Oh,
that's
cool.
It's one of those big words that people are using these days.
Okay.
And there are studies out there somewhere that have indicated that transfer is difficult and that we aren't as good at it as we think we are and should be, and so on. And your approach contributes to transfer, helps transfer in so many ways. And I'm sure you achieve that transfer of, for your students, you help them to make connections with other disciplines, you help them take the knowledge they learn in your class and take it to another place and use it, whether it's another classroom or a job afterwards or whatever. You're doing all of that, and that's very valuable, I think. So congratulations.
Thank you. Well, it doesn't always work, and sometimes I have to say I don't know more than I'm comfortable with. But okay, good. It's not going to be good.
So my interest in this, honestly, is, so great word, transfer. For me, I look at this as almost application of whatever it is we're trying to teach. So, accounting, not your typical liberal arts, right? However, I try and frame of reference for the students is what makes things click. So if I can get it into words that they understand or the situation they've been in, a scenario, think about cost accounting, which you love so much, Colby. Like a cost accounting scenario or management accounting. So we're looking at it. All right, that's great, but I've never worked in a business. Okay, so what have you done? Because it permeates everything. You've done a budget for interim, you've done cost accounting. Right? So
No, I didn't because you were my partner.
You got to look at that budget and say, nice fixed and variable costs. Right? So if I can get into their terms, and that's where I look at, so whatever discipline, whatever background they're coming from. Like, I just saw something in the student paper the other day, in the school paper, talked about the grant, the new environmental grant. And we're supposed to get an environmental project manager or something like that. So as soon as we hire that person, I'm going to be on them to see if I can use my classes to help them cost the savings of these particular environment things, or measure, right? Because that's what we're doing in many ways. So just, can they apply what they're learning in the classroom to other scenarios? Because that's what they do. They have to apply it across disciplines. And I think you're doing the same thing with English, right? So if I learn I think first, if I learn to read and interpret well, then that means I can read and interpret a historical text and maybe also convert it over to religious text or other type of text and really help me understand, read and do an accounting text and really figure out what they're saying. So there is some interdisciplinarity there, but it's really just being able to cross those boundaries and apply it in different scenarios. In some way, that's, again, my take.
I do always think about these things as being spatial, and I feel like I'm wondering how people who do research in other eras, right, aren't, I'm late 20th century, 21st century lit. I wonder how that works temporally as well, like if you're making connections in 18th, 19th century topics and sort of, I do feel like that's one of the deficits of talking about interdisciplinarity. It lends itself to a spatial more than temporal openness.
I share your anxiety in terms of,
Oh.
trying to give students or provide them with context to certain texts. So I teach a class every Lumen on multiculturalism in the German-speaking world, and I tried to bring in voices like you and I talked about from other peoples, like the Roma and Sinti in the German-speaking area, the Jewish diaspora, and so some of those texts are in German, but some are not. And sometimes it's hard to find, or difficult to find the voices of people whose stories have not been told or translated into either German or English. And I'm often trying to make connections to the today, so they're to today. I mean, to make those connections for students. And I was going to say, Beata and I try really hard, I think, to be really, we're sorry, the Monday afternoon lull in my brain, to be intentional, as we're about having our students make connections between their German major and their usual double major. I mean, all of ours are double or triple majors. So in class, I know what their majors are, and I'll refer to things or say, what do you think? And we have these wonderful discussions. So one of my students studied psychology, so we were talking about Freud, and we were talking about post-trauma and the World War I poems were reading by soldiers who survived. And so they, not only do they make, do the others then see the connections, but I think it empowers the students somehow, and then they actually like want to be called upon to show their expertise. And I always learn something. And so it's a nice, it's something that's very unique for the German program, I think. I think not all languages. I don't think everyone's a double major, but big money in Spanish, most people are. Right?
Yes,
So,
more than majors.
yeah. I think it helps to force them a little bit, or to encourage them to make those connections with their other majors.
And what I really like that you're doing is making the students to bring the content to class. And when you say that you ask them to do research and they come with the information, that's what I like the most, because that is active learning, and that is students being experts, and that is related to what Kristen is saying when she asks all the students. I think that's key, because now that we are not supposed to be like lecturing, I mean, we want to be we're learning classrooms where the students we are more guides, and then we want the students to be the ones, because with technology, the information is just right there. So they can, not in all disciplines, of course, but in many disciplines, they can bring the content to the classrooms, and that's why I don't use books. Right. My students have to bring the content too, so I think that's really important.
I have a question for you to know about kind of this point. I like how you said you gesture towards the absence of things that you might not be able to bring to the classroom.
Yes.
And I think one of the things we value kind of in the discipline is many disciplines, leaving open that space for a problem not even to be solved that day or the next day, but perhaps in the future by other disciplines.
Yeah, right.
So how do you encourage that in the classroom, both trying to withhold your own instinct or, to solve the problem right there, but also just to tell them you might not get the full answer from Google, you might have to wait a while and live with that ambiguity. So I don't know how you encourage that.
Carol helps me live with it, because she told me one time, it's okay, I always leave class feeling as though we're not quite finished, and that's a good thing. I said, yes. If Carol said it's okay, it's okay. And, it's
Never finished.
that would make a great essay topic, is a phrase I use a lot, but it's true. Although it's still bugging me about the Colabotto novel, I really do want to know more about that one. But some of them really get me. But I think that they have to understand at a very basic linguistic level that we're talking about, lots of, that's just, I feel like, crucial to our field, that you're always going to be haunted by the possibility of the next interpretation you hadn't thought of. And they don't seem to be too judgmental. I don't think so, right? In terms of the questions that your professors can't answer. Cole's been in my survey class for 204, and it's one of the ways that I sort of had to figure out, I really need to explain there are some, basics where, maybe there's some things I can forgive myself for not being able to explain, but I really need to give them the background if they're going to read Ha Zhen on the Cultural Revolution in China. You can't not, right? So, and it's hard for me to know sometimes what students aren't going to know when they come in a classroom, or what they find interesting, or what they'll choose as content. So if I have students bring content into class, and I have them report on it, because I think I never would show them a flag and the president of the country, because that's not that interesting to me. I can't analyze that. But they find it to be somehow comforting, that they see something down there that is a fact, and and just knowing it's there. So I let them do that, and I give them minimal credit for it, and they probably spend more time on it than they do my papers and make PowerPoints. And
So I'm really taken with your phrasing of a syllabus being haunted. Because I've thought about it in different ways of what, something always has to be left out. There's always a perspective. The syllabus itself is an argument. But the idea, are you using the word haunted sort of in the sense of haunted by the perspectives that aren't presented, or are you haunted by sort of some image of a tweety professor saying you're outside your discipline.
Yeah, that might be it. But both, right? The unfinished, the excess of any, novel in the short, week that we would have on it, or the unrepresented voices. Although most of my classes tend to thematize marginalized voices. I've had students. I'll give you an example. I've had students read books in classes alongside mine in Chinese and Japanese and say, here's how it's translated to here. And this is fascinating, and because sometimes it will really be better and more interesting than the copy I'm working with. And I'm like, well, holy crap, what else are we missing? And that's it. I think that's it. It's not something that keeps me from wanting to do it this way.
I think for us that's especially true of translation.
Yeah.
But also
Yeah.
sometimes of texts, of which there is more than one published version.
Yeah.
Quite a number of,
Right.
Frankenstein, there are two completely different
Oh,
texts
yeah.
of Frankenstein or Daisy Young. And
Right.
then you were always thinking,
Mhm.
that way.
But even the way that language changes over time.
Mhm.
But you come to read something that would not have read the same. That happens all the time.
Yeah. It does.
When I taught at Bollywood interim,
Yeah.
and there were subtitles, and some of the students in the class knew Hindi or knew whatever the subtitles were, and they'd watch it and they'd say, oh, that's not what he said. And they'd explain, and so we'd stop it and they'd say, here's what they actually said, here's the words they
Yes.
used and everything. And I had the same kind of like, oh.
Yes. That's what I
should
mean.
use that.
Yes, I should be the one sharing that surprise. I had a student in class the other day who said, we were reading something from Bangladesh, and there's a character who says, "Sir, ma'am," and they were thinking, oh, it's just a misunderstanding of language. Well, one of my students, his family speaks Bengali, says, oh, well, it's actually that our term for respect is not gendered. And there's probably, this is awesome. This is great. And also, and I'm totally not telling my future classes that you told me that. I'm going to pretend like I knew it. No. But I really, I think that's one of the things where I've learned to be sort of non-competitive with myself in terms of, I'm just picking up things from students too. I wouldn't have known.
I guess that was it. More, not even so much I wish I'd been the one to tell it, but just like, what else am I missing?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Luckily, our classes are only 50 minutes long, so that we'd have to leave off something.
This is taking a conversation in a different area, but I find myself increasingly confused by disciplines, not interdisciplinary stuff. Like I struggle. The longer I've been here at Wofford, the longer I've been researching in my own field, teaching in my own field, I struggle to identify what it is that makes religion a distinct thing. But not all the time. I mean, it's easier for me to think about, okay, what's the difference between religion and like computer science, perhaps, or accounting and finance. Although I think there are many times where the overlaps happen. But I've been really wrestling with this. Like, we have this model that we're schooling that we've been trained in, a graduate school, where we're in distinct, rigid disciplines, and then we get like a sub-discipline that's like really narrow and even deeper, and it's like we've assumed this sort of scientific kind of, species, genus, I don't even know how the tree works, but I mean, like, keep subdivided, it's like this two-dimensional thing where there's like, you end up with all of these things that are supposed to be distinct entities. But I wonder if like a more accurate model, at least it seems more accurate to me, is like you need a three-dimensional model where these things that we've given names to are just that they overlap with each other in different interesting ways. And so it's, so like when I teach, or this became very apparent to me in my sabbatical year when I was researching professional wrestling. But it was religion because it was evangelical. It was like right in the heart of what my specialty should be. But yet I discovered I had to become an expert in Southern history, and then I had to learn about class. Mm-hmm. And these are two things I didn't know anything about. But these were supposedly in the heart of my field.
Yeah, and right, and so, but then my methodology became ethnography,
Yeah.
right, which is not, well, it's kind of religion, but it's, anthropology. And yeah, so it's just like, is there a different, what would a disciplinary mode be? It's hard for me to even figure out what that would look like.
I was thinking that before I got here and wondering, is it about the lens that we use to look at things, or is it about the text that we choose? If your text is professional wrestling, that determines which sort of lens you're going to, maybe. I don't know.
But, yeah,
'Cause I'm a close reader, but now I'm
yeah.
starting to wonder, does everybody just do that?
Every subject that I've ever studied in my field is not one that's owned by my field. Like it's any humanity, but even sciences, how you describe English as being this interdisciplinary whatever is like exactly how I think of religion. I mean, you go to our professional conference and there's like the psychology, actually subspecialties of psychology of religion. You have philosophers of religion. You have sociology of multiple sessions on all these things. You have stuff in the hard sciences, neuroscience and religion. You have on and on and on.
So just there's a lot of crossover, but there's one focal point. So you are kind of focused on the religious aspect of it, but it still involves reading the English language or reading the Spanish language or whatever. Because I think there is a lot of crossover.
I don't know. An English department, one
There are
cannot
people
talk
who write
about
on religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
In the history, who teaches American history doesn't talk about religion? Or maybe they do that enough.
Or rhetoric.
Well, and I'm thinking too, just sort of what might a student understand the difference to be, or what are our sort of seat of the pants assumptions about the differences between the way our curriculum's lined up now, between interdisciplinarity or multi or trans or whatever, and intercultural studies, interdisciplinary versus intercultural. Well,
yeah.
I mean, I have theories of what we seem to think we mean by that, but
I'm sure
because those are kind of things, right?
Still learning that one. I do see intercultural and interdisciplinary as mixed. They're together because of. It certainly. Post-colonialism certainly changed my field. I didn't have a teacher who taught, didn't have any classes in college that taught an African work of literature or literature from India for that matter, or any of the colonies. And then not even when I went to grad school. I think that the post-colonial hire got there when I left. And it was a huge 40-plus size department, so yeah, it's
when you were talking about what the students bring to class, I was thinking this is like reader response theory, where there are multiple perspectives in text, and then what happens between that dead page and the mind is where the text the text is, and so maybe that would be like the discipline, but it only really comes alive in conversation where and that would be somewhere in between the text and the mind would be the interdisciplinarity.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be another thing.
Right.
The discipline, what would it be to read a piece of literature just as, how would
literal?
you do that?
I don't know.
In order to read it, it has to start moving between.
Yeah.
Also, for English, to get back to Dan's observation, that if the conundrum really of a discipline, which is that we both need it, or we need some kind of parameter for what we do, pragmatically, institutionally, historically, we need some sort of but we seem to be almost defined by the way we spill over those boundaries. That's the sort of paradox of what we do. And the thing I was going to say is just, the actual thing I was going to say.
But it's easier to describe ourselves to our colleagues if we have some kind of label.
Yeah.
I remember at a conference where you came out of some talk or something, you said, I just found a name for what I do. I didn't realize it was a thing. It was a thing. I remember that. Yeah.
You have have to imagine the job description too, of that, we would just like anybody, we just you have to be able to teach something. We'd like your PhD, should be in something, and value energy. That's what we need. Curiosity.
Curiosity. Yes.
But I think, Daniel, a point about methodology is how is it that we approach a text? Is it instrumentalized to teach something else? Is the text itself? But it still gets tricky because most fields take different methodologies, but there seems to be something there. Is it applied? Is it theoretical? So I don't know what that boundary is, but that seems to separate perhaps your approach from an anthropologist. Then when methodology overlaps, maybe then you look at objective analysis as a separate. And I don't know that you need to, but
I don't know. I don't know the methodologies. I think probably in some, like across some disciplines, that you can definitely, I can see there's a methodology that they do in a chemistry class that I don't know exactly how that would pertain to religious studies. Although, having just said that, having those words just spoken out of my mouth, I'm now thinking of the seminar I'm teaching right now, where we're reading some of the early mid-20th century religion scholars who actually were trying to do exactly that methodology, apply it to the field of religion, which we don't do much anymore, but that was definitely what they thought they were doing.
Well, and also I'm sitting in on Wesley Pesch's quantitative critical reasoning course, interdisciplinary, but he's using economics to analyze the scientific method and how we make decisions based on that. So it's almost the methodology becomes the object of study rather than the methodology itself.
That's a very humanities thing.
Yeah.
Making the methodology an object of study. Turning it into a text, essentially.
Yeah, but even that field has a lot of disruption. Are you a quantitative approach or qualitative?
Yeah, and those arguments happen in religion too, but those happen it's like those are the arguments of academia that just happen to happen in this thing we call, that Trina and I call, and others call religion. I don't know. It's really hard for me to really understand conceptually, except the fact that religion's the second floor of Maine, and, like spatially we separate ourselves, but conceptually I have a really hard time. Talking to Matt Cathy, hear him talk about mathematics. Like math is something I would think, okay, that's very different than what I do. But hear him talk about it, and he places it, when he was very poetic, he places mathematics more in the humanities than he does in the sciences.
I remember Jamie Haynes talked about explaining theoretical physics to me one day, which is a picture for y'all to do. And for just a moment there, and the more he talked, the more I said, it really sounds a lot like philosophy.
Absolutely.
And he said, yes. And I love that he had an education in which he could affirm me in that. Language that I picked up a long time ago working with Joyce is the idea of limited affirmation. I think that's maybe one of our postmodern places where we land, that we can affirm to a point, and then we spill over. I like a lot, that space where we can't do. What interests me tremendously is, maybe it's a holdover, maybe so I say I'm one of the old people in the room, but I'm hearing a lot of, if it's not anxiety, it's interest in what I'd still consider to be some desire to be masters. Some pressure for mastery that those of us that don't have much ability gave up a long time ago. But what is the other language for it? Or is there something to celebrate there? What's when you talk about the thing that's not defined, that's not there, the space, is that a threat? Is it a risk, or is it an opportunity? And do I even have the language to think about that, or do I just come to it from some emotional place based on my experiences and my fear of my inadequacies? And and what that is about teaching, and that's the part that just is really fascinating.
Well, that's where fraud complex
there you
comes
go.
from that, because we try to pretend in graduate school, oh yes, I know that.
Or I give you exams.
And that's the Tweedy professor I was thinking of, like this, is like this the platonic form of the master of something. So you can't be in our club anymore. You've gone outside of the boundaries.
I got the Tweedy professor and the mom on the other side. And who do you think you are? That's not your field.
I was just going to say that we're not off the hook in that respect, are we? Because of the way we treat our students. And I'm not saying that we are necessarily authoritarian or patriarchal or whatever, but there is a sense that we convey to them. I think even the most sort of reciprocal among us and open, that there are these knowledges that you have to master, and there are these skills that you have to demonstrate, and we will award you accordingly. And it really matters how how much we reward you. And so there is a coming up through the ranks that then once you've completed it, you're free to sort of relax and acknowledge your ignorance, as we're all doing. Anything, And it's not quite. I don't know. That's not quite ingenuine. I mean, it's not quite true. I also think about the Gerald Grass. I don't know back in the 1980s during the theory wars. Because English studies went through. It almost imploded really in the 1980s, and the field was being so fiercely contested that people were being denied tenure and, fist fights at conferences and all kinds of things.
Seriously?
Yeah. Well, that was just me, actually.
Is this over deconstruction?
But, there was a very pragmatic guy who came up with this idea of teaching conflicts.
Yeah.
That's what we have to do. That's the solution to this, because we can't agree on anything about English studies whatsoever. So we teach the conflicts, and that's the way through this. But that's a sort of acknowledgement that you have to expose to students some of the difficulty of justifying the way you've constructed what you do.
Yeah. I have to go back and read my Gerald Graff.
Well, I don't know. It's irritating.
Did you ever see it this far at the conference?
No, but I did. I mean, I did hear about. I almost saw. I saw something that almost.